Welcome back to another episode of
Just
a
a
Squirrel
squirrel
looking
looking
for a
for a
nut,
nut,
trying
trying
to
to
get
get out
out
of
this
this
rut.
rut. All right, that was 98% there.
It sure
The
was. I was
only
trying to time myself on the last one. I think, and I'm going off of muscle memory, but sometimes you say trying to, and then sometimes you say trying, and then you go to get out of this.
Okay. Well, that is an area for us to practice on. And maybe I just need to bring a little consistency to the table there.
Yeah,
Because,
come on.
you have a dog. I grew up with dogs. And I've got to say, there's nothing they like more than consistency. I see
Oh, yeah.
Annie Lieb is in the house. I see Michelle Madden's in the house. Do you all agree that dogs like consistency? Because if you do, this is the absolute right show for you. And it is good to see you ladies here today as well as anybody else. Oleg, before we talk any more about consistency,
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about how I grew up. My mother worked for a dog food factory. She was a secretary there. They made Gaines burgers and puppy chow, which I don't know if they still even make anymore. But, they always would have these commercials on TV saying that 3 out of 4 dogs like such and such dog food more than the competitor. And our dog was one of those test dogs, and he always liked our dog food more than the competitor's dog food. So we always had to tell him, our dog was one of those 3 out of 4. Why? Because dogs don't like to ever change their food. They were never going to like the competitor's food as much because it wasn't what they were already eating. The only way our dog would have liked the competitor's dog food more is if our dog saw us eating dog food. Then it would have changed.
And that would be quite the day, right?
That would be quite the day. But anyone who has seen the movie Showgirls will tell you that there are people that eat dog food, and there's a whole other backstory with that movie and that. Let me ask you that. And let me ask you this. The issue of why we eat dog food or not, it's not like dog food is inedible. It's a status issue. And so I noticed that Annie immediately said she adores her pet and so do her kids. And I assume many other people that are watching this, whether live or on replay, are people with pets who adore them as well. But do you believe, Oleg, that there is a status difference in your household between you and Caleb, your dog? And if so, why?
Well, I feel like there probably is. And I mean, let's start with the whole food component of it all. So it's not necessarily of do I think it's edible or not. It's more so just looking at his food and not finding it appealing to begin with. Outside of that, I think when I change his food, and let's say I'll give him, I don't know, rice and chicken and then lamb and whatever else. One of the things that I experience on the back end is the diarrhea. So he not only does the physical change in food causes maybe his appetite, and sometimes he's what I call a very privileged dog, in that he has the not only ability to eat, but he gets to pick and choose when he eats. So sometimes he'll literally refuse to go near the dog bowl, even though it's really high quality food, and he just won't choose to eat it. Or sometimes he truly is not hungry, and because he doesn't have internal competition with another dog or another animal, he understands that he can eat his breakfast whenever, and he can eat his lunch whenever. So as far as the status or the hierarchy, I don't think it's anything I consciously am aware of, but I can definitely see that it exists because of the fact that when I look at dog food, it is not something that I want to put in the back of my mouth by any means. It's
Why do you think that if we love our dogs as much as we say we do, we allow the dog food to look so unappetizing to us?
It's a really good question. I think part of that probably goes to the culture of how it was presented to maybe many of us as far as what dog food looks like. But I've also heard of people, in fact, I know of a couple of people that actually don't feed their dogs dog food. What they do instead is they will take the time out of their day to make rice, make beans, cook eggs, and they serve them the same exact food as they would eat. And I don't know if it's necessarily a question of right or wrong. It's just more so a question of convenience and something that I don't actively question because I don't fully understand the quote unquote disadvantages and advantages to the dog food that the dog experience. Like maybe it's good for them, maybe there's certain parts that are not, and maybe the reason why there is a differentiation between dog food and human food to begin with is that maybe the human food doesn't give them enough protein.
Maybe. Now, Kenneth Dunner just joined the conversation. Kenneth, good to see you. I'm glad that the conversation sounds scrumptious, but I wonder to what extent our dogs think that food that we give them is really scrumptious. And what do you all think? And is there anyone who's watching or listening to this show who does this sort of cooking for the dogs themselves? Or do you buy dog food or cat food if it's a cat that you have? And if so, why do you all choose to do that as opposed to cooking for your pets just like you do other family members?
You know, I think that's a really interesting point that you bring up for a couple reasons. I was actually just having a conversation like this with a friend of mine, and we were talking about attachment to animals. And in particular, how sometimes the attachment becomes so great where the loss of them is something that is just unbearing to experience. And it really got me curious as far as, okay, if I'm so attached to the animal, and in this case, Caleb's presence and everything about him, why is it that I don't treat his meal prep with the same exact sense of love and caring and nourishment that I care for him outside of that? So he is a very fortunate dog today because he ended up getting a bath. Now, he doesn't like getting baths. It's always a challenge for me to get him near water.
Does he understand when he's about to go in to get a bath?
Oh, yeah.
At this point?
Oh, trust me. He understands it to a point where I can't find him. He hides. He purposely hides. And like today when I was giving him a bath, he does this thing where he thinks he's getting in trouble, like his tail is down, he's all hunched down, when the reality of the matter is, he's getting a bath. But it maybe doesn't register the same exact way for dogs as far as what is the purpose of the bath, because, and here's the reason why I say that. After I give him a bath, his first instinct is to go roll in the dirt.
Yes, the dogs I grew up with did that too.
It's a complete polar opposite of my intention of wanting to keep him clean and do all these things, because the next thing he does is as soon as we go outside, he literally digs a hole in the whatever pot of dirt or land that's nearest to him, and he lays in that. Now, part of it, I can see it's like to keep him cool and everything, but how do you explain that when it's quote unquote winter? What's the thinking behind that?
I wonder if the dogs feel like they've lost their natural scent with the bath.
Probably.
They're very nose oriented. One of the things I wanted to do this morning, in my email box came a blog that I subscribed to. And it was an article there was an article in today's blog that said that it was going to be about the senses animals have that humans don't. And I was so doggone mad that I couldn't read that article, because I wonder to what extent dogs and cats and other animals that are close to us have senses that we simply don't have any conception of, or if in fact they are merely limited to our senses, but they have heightened abilities with regards to those. And smell is quite clearly one of those things that dogs have an extremely high level of compared to humans. For instance, when we're tracking down other people, we don't put our noses to the ground and start to sniff in order to find them. Or at least I don't. Oleg, if you do that, we'll go back to our first episode about shame, and we'll talk about that with you.
But I will also add on to it, because you brought up a really interesting point and kind of inspired this thought within me. I was thinking, and I think this somewhat relates to the conversation that we've had with Patrick around this whole concept of disability and ability. And one of the things that I am beginning to understand, having had however many different conversations by now with people who are quote unquote labeled disabled in certain areas of their lives. So I'm beginning to understand and believe that, yes, the person may not have a certain ability in X, Y, and Z area, but the time and energy that you and I would put into that area that they don't have, what I'm finding is that they're actually putting elsewhere. So I would like to think that the same thing applies to dogs. So for example, because they're not able to speak English, instead of them putting that time and energy into the spoken word, they might be putting that into hearing or seeing. And so therefore those senses are enhanced, and therefore they might be able to experience things that we're not able to experience because they're so much more in tune to them. So they're putting all of their focus into those things where we're having to put our focus, or we're having to split our focus amongst 5 or 6 different areas.
Do you believe that Caleb, your dog, has a soul? And by the way, Kenneth, thank you for the compliments today to both Oleg and I.
Does a dog have a soul?
Yes.
Good question, because it also makes me think of another conversation I had yesterday about, do animals have consciousness? And I don't know. I don't know, to be honest with you. I haven't reflected upon that throughout my life. I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that a dog has a soul or some sort of higher energy or presence. And the reason why I think that is because there have been times throughout my life and my experience with Caleb where I felt that I was able to communicate outside of the spoken word or anything habitual.
Tell us about an example of that.
So, for example, sometimes this happens in the mornings where I would get up, and let's say I'm getting this, especially happens when I get up at a time that is not consistent. So instead of being at 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. in the morning, I'll get up at 8 or 9 a.m. The very first thing that I'm able to sense is that he almost understands one of my very first thoughts. That's oftentimes going for a walk. So as soon as I make movement, I could see him going from what is perceived to be sleeping position to all of a sudden like alert and ready to go. Now, I don't know if that's habit-based or if that's just like a general exchange of energy that we're able to go through. I will also say this: moments where I feel sadness, so where I'm crying or experiencing something, I can sense that he's feeling those things with me, because he will come by, he'll lick my face, he will sit next to me, or even lay down in those situations. So if he didn't have a soul, or if he didn't have this higher form of connection, how is it that he's able to experience the same state that I am and know almost like exactly what to do as far as his response goes?
Do you think all pets have that ability?
Probably not. I think it's probably, well, it's hard to say because I haven't had all pets. I've only been around.
Yes, you have. Every pet that has ever existed in the entire history of humanity, you have personally had, and you better be accountable for right now.
No, I've only been around dogs. My parents have cats, and a couple of my friends have cats. I've been around like lizards and snakes. To be completely transparent with you, those two I don't understand. I'm at a point where I can't even relate to their existence, because they just live in such a different world where I'm having a hard time conceptualizing like, what does their day to day even look like?
Yeah.
You know, are they fascinated by the squirrel running outside like my dog is, or do they truly not care and not even choose to ponder upon that thought? So there's certain pets that I have a difficult time relating and resonating with, just because I truly don't understand their way of living.
I wonder to what extent dogs and cats in particular, maybe some other pets too, those who might have some primates as pets, irrespective of the wisdom of that.
Yeah.
To what extent they actually wonder things about humans. And the reason why that has come up a lot for me recently has been because of the impact of the pandemic on the way that human beings behave. So I live in New York City. For those of you who don't know, I know that you know that full well, Oleg. And New York City is a dog-loving city. and you walk out at any time, day or night, and people will be out on the streets with their dogs on leashes, usually if they are on the street, although there are dog parks throughout the city where the dogs get to be off their leashes and run around with other dogs and have all sorts of fun and play and be cute. And when dogs walk around the city, I notice that they, especially if they're on a leash, or maybe especially if they're not on a leash, they tend to notice two things in particular. One, they always notice another dog, or they always seem to. And then number two, they seem to notice humans, certain humans more than others. For instance, there is a dog that has a human that hangs out at the coffee shop that Lucretia Lamura, who is a regular fan of this show, owns. That's not that far away from my house. And that dog, for whatever reason, just dislikes me. Most dogs love me. That dog hates me. And when he could see my face, the minute his eyes would look at mine, he would start to growl and snarl and want to lunge at me, no matter when it was, what time of night and day, no matter what I was doing. When I began to wear masks, it took him a little bit longer, I think, to figure out who I was before he started to express his hatred of me. And it got me wondering, when the pandemic began, did dogs notice and cats notice at all, but dogs because they're outside more.
Yeah.
Did they start to notice all of a sudden people were covering their faces? And if so, did they question why? Or in their minds, were they like, oh, that's just another thing people are doing? Or did they not notice at all? It's hard to believe that dogs wouldn't notice that all of a sudden everyone out on the street, human beings, had 3/4 of their faces covered. But I don't know, and I don't understand. And it's hard for me to believe that dogs didn't notice that every time they were going for a walk, all of a sudden, the people that were taking them on a walk were putting masks on their face and covering it up. And dogs know, at least that I've been able to observe, how to read human faces. What are your thoughts on that? And what do you think that means about the extent to which dogs or other pets, cats, whatever, are interpreting the world that they are in rather than just experiencing it?
Well, before I answer that, I want to ask you a question. So in regard to that dog, did the relationship status change from it's complicated to in a relationship, or is it still it's complicated?
Complicated? I think it's simple. It hates me. I don't know why. And the owner herself I've spoken to, or the human herself I've spoken to about this, and she herself doesn't know why. She thinks it's random. She said, look, sometimes dogs, Scott, they just hate people for reasons that have nothing to do with you. It might be because you're a man and had a bad experience with a man, or it doesn't like your smell, or your walk threatens it in a certain way, or anything.
Going to your question, I think that there's a question within that I'm thinking, and I don't know how to best answer it, and that is, can animals think? Do animals have the ability to think, or is their world strictly based off of habitual patterns, which doesn't require much thought?
Instinct?
Yeah. It's like, I peed on this tree, I'll pee on this tree tomorrow, and I'll pee on this tree the week after. Does that require any thought behind it? And the other thing is instinct, just like you pointed out. Smelling someone else's pee and then wanting to dominate. So wanting to have your smell being a dominating smell within that particular space or area. That's how I like to think, like, my dog oftentimes operates. But I will say this, and I don't know if this is necessarily a habit that was developed within him. So I'd like to think that he's a very smart dog, and here's why. There are times where, let's say, he'll walk around the pole, and he'll walk around the quote-unquote wrong side of the pole. So it would require me to walk all the way around. Otherwise, there's the leash literally is wrapped around it. So neither of us can move. He will go around it without me even making a sound or gesture towards him needing to change his course or needing to go around. So in that particular moment, is that a process of questioning that he's able to go through? Or has it become so habitual that he understands that, okay, tension caused in my back, there's a pole here, I'm probably on the wrong side of it, I need to go around.
Mm-hmm.
Which in that case as well, like that's a form of questioning
Mm-hmm.
that he would have to experience. Now I'm completely assuming because I'm putting my brain in in my dog's brain and thinking that that's how it works. But I have been curious about that is, do animals have the capacity to think? Therefore, do they have the capacity to make rational decisions throughout their lives? And if so, to what degree and what limitation might they experience when it comes to that rational thought?
Well, another thing that your example is causing me to question is to what extent also do animals internalize language?
Exactly.
We know that dogs can understand human language to a limited extent. Otherwise, they wouldn't be trainable to respond to human commands. And there have been a number of different tests where differences in the vocabulary understanding abilities of various individual dogs have been noted and observed. Apparently, there's one dog, I think it might have been a collie, that is notorious for having had the widest vocabulary of any dog known to humanity. Apparently could understand close to 300 words.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah. And it was able to understand commands at a much more sophisticated level and of a much higher degree of complexity than the average dog that is trained does. So it was the Einstein of the dog community.
That's a pretty large set.
It is a large set. Like, it is.
I'm just thinking of like, how many words do you think we use when it comes to our communication as humans?
Well, particularly when you think about the number of words that you would use in communication directly with an animal, not as much around an animal, but to the animal itself. It is pretty large. And some of the things that it could understand, and it were quite startling. And not only that, but it could pick up on new words pretty quickly. Things that didn't necessarily have in its day-to-day experience that it might just sort of learn through osmosis. But in any event, one of the things that this all relates to in my mind, and then goes back to your question about to the extent to which dogs have reasoning and rational thinking skills as opposed to pure instinctive responses, is the idea that I'm sure you've observed. I observed it in the dogs we had growing up, which is that dogs dream.
Yes.
And of course, anyone who's seen a dog dream wonders what it's dreaming about. But one thing that I wonder is if it dreams with any of the language that it hears. To what extent, for instance, do words like no appear in a dog's dream? Or to what extent does Caleb, your dog, see you and in its dream, and then maybe you come to it with a leash and say walk, and in its dream it gets excited? Or to what extent is it starting to run after a squirrel looking for a nut?
Yeah.
And it hears you say no, sit, and then it does in his dream.
I also wonder, and I don't know if maybe this is more of a question outside of pets. I'm curious to hear your perspective on it. But do dreams require thought?
They seem to have, at least in my case, some sort of internal logic. There is communication that goes on in those dreams between me and other people. There are narrative storylines, even if when I wake up, they don't seem to make sense. While I am experiencing them in the dream, they do make sense. And sometimes even when I remember them after the fact, they make sense, even if really the situations that are occurring in the dream don't make sense. I have a lot of dreams of zombie apocalypses and fighting and defending those, or protecting my husband. I have a recurring dream of being in a large mall in Minnesota and going into the store and looking for ties, one of the anchor stores, and then going deeper and deeper and deeper into that store, and then leaving, and then finding some obscure store with awesome stuff and the ties that I like, in this distant part of the mall, and no one else finds it. I've had that dream over and over. Another one is that I am looking for Donna Summer records in obscure record stores, and I find a series of them that no one else has. And those stories all have an internal logic. They clearly involve things that require thinking.
Yeah.
Like, I need to find a tie, and the tie that I want is not in this particular department store. So let me search through the internal alleyways of this mall to find the exact skinny tie that I need from the right salesperson. That's my answer to that.
I wonder if pets to a degree experience a similar form of reality, because I will say this, I don't know if you ever experienced this being around dogs, but Caleb, sometimes when he goes to sleep, I know when he's dreaming because he's making sounds.
Yes.
He's making sounds and his paws also start moving as if he's going on a run and chasing after.
Or they may whine.
Exactly. And so
growl.
I know exactly when it happens.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me because in that moment, it's as if everything stops and I'm completely captured by thought. And that thought of what is he thinking? What is he experiencing? What is happening within his dream? Because here I am on the other side. I'm making assumptions that he might be chasing a squirrel or he's trying to find the nut, the squirrel's nut, whatever it is. But at the same time, like, he could be going through a complete other experience. Like, I was recently watching The Hobbit.
Yeah.
And I, binge watched all 3 of them just because of how good the story is. And those are pretty lengthy films.
Your rear end was probably quite tired by the end of that day. Please don't tell me you were watching the extended director's cuts, because then we're talking about 5 hours of film.
No, it's just the regular ones. But it really got me thinking as far as this whole connection to pets, and in particular pets dreaming. Because, here's a hobbit that goes on an unexpected quest, and there's so many life lessons to even pick up from that, like working as a team and understanding that your sense of purpose, it can get developed by going on an unexpected adventure and then being met with a certain set of challenges and things like that. But whole reason why I'm making that point is because I wonder if the dog sometimes goes on an adventure of his own. And then to what degree, what does that adventure look like? Where do they go? Are there limitations that they're experiencing because they're not able to tap into some of the senses and, I guess, realities that we're able to tap into? I think one of the reasons why I'm reading this book, it talks about the origin of consciousness, and it makes a case how animals are not able to experience form of consciousness. Well, I started to dig deeper within that, and I realized that dolphins, to a degree, and for anyone, please don't quote me on this, but there's a theory that they might be able to experience a form of consciousness because they do have a language that they correspond in. So it really gets me curious as far as to what degree are animals truly different from us.
If you found out definitively that your dog, or dogs across the board, or dogs and cats and our other major pet groups, had no consciousness at all, would that make you sad?
Yes and no. I think the yes part, because yes, it would feel like I'm not necessarily truly different, but I may not be understood by them, nor would I be able to have a deeper connection or experience a deeper connection with them. No, because consciousness is such a loaded topic. I don't even know if I fully understand what that is and why I'm only able to experience a glimpse of it throughout my day, if that. And then from there, outside of it is just awareness. Me being aware of my surroundings is not really consciousness, because I understand where the picture is and where this thing is. So a lot of it's just memory and experience based. So it's a really good question. What do you think? How would you feel?
On the one hand, sad, because experiencing it so profoundly defines me as a human. and it is so tied to my identity. And so for a dog in particular that I would have as a companion for the duration of its life, and if depending on my own life circumstances, the duration of my own life, to not have that shared experience, especially a shared experience that's so wonderful, would break my heart. On the other hand, is that an imposition of my ego and my ego needs on a completely different species that doesn't even have the same needs that I have?
Exactly.
The dog may not care. The dog, if a dog does not have a consciousness, the dog can in no way imagine what it would be like to have one. And therefore, the dog would never feel loss.
Mm-hmm.
And even if the dog were able to imagine having a consciousness, it may just simply accept that as something that it doesn't have and not care. Just as much as I know I don't have ESP. But do I feel a tragic sense of loss not having it? Absolutely not.
Yeah. Well, I think that also goes back to the point of it's difficult to miss. It's hard to be conscious of something that you are not conscious of. You know, it's like the same exact thing. For example, if I'm not holding $1 million, then therefore I don't know what it's like to not have or to have $1 million.
Well, so that I can imagine.
So, but I think with the dog, it's probably a similar thing. And the more that I think about, especially Caleb's life, I'd like to think that he lives a relatively stress-free life. But at the same time, I'm assuming because he might constantly be thinking in survival mode. I mean, think about it this way, right? Here's a dog that I adopted at 3 years old who was exchanged between however many different owners before I was able to provide a home for him. So what do those transitions have in his life and how do they impact his life? I mean, you and I look at our lives and the impact that our transitions have had on us. Now think about a dog who may not have the same way to process the trauma, to process their transitions. What type of life is he experiencing because of that? Is he always in a survival mode? Is he always in stress? What does anxiety look like for him? Is it through the roof because he doesn't have the space? I'm assuming that space is kind of the ultimate thing to process much of this. But if he doesn't have the space nor a properly trained therapist to sit down with him and address the different things that he's going through, is he constantly living in that state?
When I worked for Urban Resource Institute, which is, as those who are regular watchers or listeners to this show know by now, the country's largest provider of domestic violence shelter services.
And it's in New York?
It is located in New York, yes.
Okay.
It launched during my time there an amazing program called PALS. People and Animals Living Shelter or something. I don't remember exactly what it stood for, but essentially this program was innovative because the overwhelming number, I would say virtually all of domestic violence shelters, did not allow domestic violence survivors who were seeking to escape their abusers to bring an animal with them unless it was unless they were blind and it was a guide dog or something like that. But they were not allowed to bring pets in with them to the shelter system. And the reasons for that were understandable. There are insurance issues related to animals. There are risks associated with animals, and there are care issues and cleanliness and a whole host of other issues that were related to animals that presumably the other domestic violence shelter service providers just didn't have the time, energy, expertise or inclination to deal with. And it's not like they were lacking capacity otherwise. They were full all the time, unfortunately. So URI, this nonprofit, decided to launch this program. And it went through a whole exercise where the staff were trained on it. The furniture in all of the rooms were reconfigured. They partnered with Purina, which is a pet food company, as well as some other companies to get care packages for the dogs and cats that would come into the shelter so that the dogs and cats would feel acclimated to their new home. Mm-hmm. And they got animal psychologists to work with the animals, because as I referenced earlier, in the case of the dog that I see at the coffee shop up the street, mm-hmm. these dogs and cats in particular were traumatized. They had observed their human, the domestic violence survivor, being abused. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they were themselves abused. Sometimes they were leverage that the abuser would use in order to terrorize the domestic violence shelter or the domestic violence victim or survivor. And then sometimes the domestic violence survivor had refused to leave the abuser for a long time because they viewed that pet as part of the family and they didn't want to just leave it behind. Sometimes the animals had been the only source of comfort that domestic violence survivor had. And so without the availability of shelters that would accept these pets, they really felt they were doing no differently than leaving their own human children behind in the care of someone that was known to be violent and abusive. Mm-hmm. And that said to me, the fact that this was deemed necessary, and there really were behaviors. I don't pretend to be a program person that was an expert in this, but even just as one of the executives that would go to the shelter to look at it, operations was my area. So I needed to make sure that they were presentable, clean, mm-hmm. could pass the state inspections, all those sorts of things. The dogs in particular, some of them seemed afraid of me, even though they'd never met me. There were male-related issues, or they were extremely overly responsive or overly protective of the space that they were in, so they had to be kept in cages all the time. They were clearly having fear and trauma-based reactions. And part of the idea, we built all of these really lovely pet havens in the backyards of these shelters. And they were intended to be peaceful, spacious, calming places, mm-hmm. so that the pets could have that, so that they were not in a constant state of crisis and fear. They didn't understand, apparently, that they had left the abusive situation behind. And like you just suggested, until these animal therapists were around them, they had no way of verbalizing any feeling states that they were having about what they were feeling or what they were observing. On some level, I will always believe that animals, particularly those that are closest to us, like dogs and cats, do have some level of consciousness, some level beyond instinct, because if that weren't the case, they wouldn't feel the attachment to the human being that was sufficient for them to understand that, oh, a man was abusing my human. There's another man. This person is a threat. And they wouldn't feel that sort of need to be able to have calm and space and re-heal and reintegrate, learn how to socialize with other animals and with people in a comfortable way again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. I also think that part of that connection, the other thing that I was thinking is more so feeling related, but I don't know if you ever experienced this, but when sometimes a dog or a cat or just any form of animal is in pain, deep inside of you, you're able to feel their pain. So I think that's where like the empathy and things like that really play a role. And I'm wondering if the same exact thing applies, not necessarily pain related, but like dog wanting to, I guess you could say it's a form of pain, dog wanting to figure out something, a puzzle, or like how to, I don't know, carry a bone across the room without stepping into X, Y, and Z, or whatever it may be. I think that like relational component.
Dog in particular and cat empathy is something I find very interesting. My instinct and based on anecdotal evidence that I've seen is that, again, on some level, they appear to have empathy. I know, for instance, I read very recently an account of a family that was at the park. And it was a mother, a father, and maybe a toddler, and then an infant. And the infant was in a carriage. And something happened with the toddler that distracted the parents. And then all of a sudden, the family dog began to randomly run after, in this very ferocious, just deadly way, what appeared to be some random man walking down the sidewalk. Well, they ran after their dog, and in that man's arms was the infant that had been in the stroller.
Oh, wow.
And so the dog, on some level, saw danger. I don't know if it was empathy or an instinct to protect, but that instinct to protect leads me to believe that on some level, it understood danger in another being that it had a connection to and was going to stop it.
Yeah, and could consciously make that decision.
Made a decision, not just, yes. On the other hand, I have also read that there are videos, security videos usually, or other sorts of videos of situations in which there are house fires or some other incident that involves danger to a human owner and a human owned by the pet.
Yeah.
And the human being is sleeping. And the animal who has an escape access just gets up and leaves.
Right.
And doesn't even bother to wake up the human, although you hear accounts of the opposite happening too.
That has happened. I can't say it's happened in my life, but I definitely know of people to whom it has happened too, where they've had certain accidents, whether it was in the house or the apartment, and dogs like that were able to, either escape or like the person cared for them. But here's another thing that, as you were sharing this, it made me think of, and I think maybe this is related to just the general question of this conversation to begin with. And that is, why do we even have pets to begin with? What does the pet give me as an individual? Is it a sense of comfort? Is it a sense of authority? That domination that might be just instinct or ingrained within probably many of us.
Right. It is interesting because the dominant thinking around why dogs became our pets was because we left them, it was that their wolf-like ancestors would dig through trash. And those dogs that were docile and able to read and communicate human facial signals were able then to be around humans more safely and clean up that trash, eliminating pests and things like that. And the protector instincts that those dogs had led them to, and the pack instincts that they had led them to view the humans whose trash they were regularly eating eventually as part of the same pack, and humans found it useful. And then over time we discovered that they were trainable and they were mutually beneficial elements to the relationship. And then dogs became both cleanup vehicles and laborers for humans, basically slave labor.
Yeah.
Only they didn't complain or rebel or try and escape. Now, that there are
we lost you there, Scott.
Am I back?
Yes, you are.
Great. The majority of dogs, at least, that are in relationships with humans are no longer laborers. Some are, but the overwhelming majority are not. Cats, from what I understand, originally came to be associated with humans many, 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 many thousands of years later than dogs. They were cleaning out and eating the rodents and other pests that were in things like grain silos or other vegetable storage facilities, and became associated with us. And we were tolerated by us because of that important function. And because, again, they were able to tolerate being around us and we're able to tolerate being around them. Cats, by all accounts, are far less domesticated. Although they are domesticated, the
Yeah.
extent of their domestication reflects the fact that they have been associated with humans for a much, much shorter time than dogs have. And I've even read that the role of dogs is so significant in human history, particularly in our ability to begin to husband other animals that we use for food, that we would not even be human beings, that civilization itself might not have ever developed, but for dogs.
That's really interesting to think about it that way, because I'm thinking of different examples throughout my own life where I was able to see the difference as far as dogs being maybe, I guess, important. That's a matter of perspective, but a key element of progress or advancement of human civilization. And I can't think of a single time where cats were the ones that were doing the labor.
Mm-hmm.
For example, for people, some of the people, at least based on the stories that I would read, living in Iceland or Alaska, some dogs, especially husky breed, they're used for labor.
Yeah.
To help pull the skis or whatever it is, or the sled. But you don't see cats doing that.
Yeah.
Now, you also got to understand that, I guess, traditionally, a normal cat probably doesn't have the strength to, by any means, drag a human being. But at the same time, domesticated cats are not the only type of cat that's out there.
Right.
So it really gets me curious as far as other cats, and why is it that the dogs are more of the go-to in many of those situations.
Do you think that whenever humans colonize space, dogs,
if we
cats,
haven't already.
What'd you say?
If we haven't already.
If we haven't already. Do you think dogs, cats, or other animals would go with us?
That's a really good question. I think it's a hard one to answer. I'd like to think yes. And the reason why I say that is I think because some people would either have or currently have strong enough connection with the animals where it almost becomes inseparable for them to not coexist. So I think there are some people that would probably make the claim, myself included, to have animals join us. But at the same time, I could also see the argument made that maybe they're not a critical part of our life or our survival. And then I guess outside of that, much of that would also depend on what is the method that we would be getting there anywhere by. And if the space is already limited, then therefore the question of who goes and what are the things that we take with us becomes an important question within that. So having pets, any form of pets, would that be a question that is even addressed? I mean, how important are pets within our lives? I guess that's another question that I'm curious. Do many of us, or some of us, whatever that number looks like, do we look at pets as necessity to life? As far as pets bringing us additional things of joy, happiness, and things that we're not able to experience on our own? Or is it more of just a convenience factor?
What is it for you?
I think for me, it's a form of necessity because I'm able to experience things due to Caleb's presence, as well as some of the other pets that have been and continue to be in my life that I don't think necessarily I experience on my own. I'll give you a couple examples. So, for example, whenever I walk Caleb, whether it's in the mornings or in the afternoons, one of the things that I've become a lot more conscious of is really giving him the time to absorb and process the different smells instead of constantly going with the mindset, go, 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 like, no, you can't stay here for the next 30 seconds to smell it. And the reason why I'm making that conscious effort is because I'm really understanding the importance of continuous exploration. And I know that, okay, if I'm constantly telling him to go, 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 and not stop and smell and explore, then I'm most likely going to translate that experience and project that experience upon people and other living things. So whenever I get that chance to consciously practice a form of behavior, I'm also understanding that whatever that behavior I'm using with him is most likely the same behavior I'm going to use with other living things, including other human beings. So if I'm not giving him the chance to explore, what are the chances that I'm going to freely give other people the chance to explore?
Why do you love Caleb?
Many reasons. I think one of them is his ability to accept me for who I am. I think the other reason is what appears to be, I don't know if necessarily lack of judgment, but no judgment, like truly in having an open mind and open presence. And the other reason why is because he is someone, regardless of the state of my own being, that doesn't appear to change his own behavior due to my outcomes. So, I could be upset and yet he's still wagging his tail. He's still wanting to inspire the thought of a better day within my own day. And to me, that's fascinating. I mean, I could be gone for 5 minutes or I could experience whatever the set of challenges, and yet he still approaches me with the same exact energy and presence. And I think that's probably one of the ultimate reasons why.
Could something happen that would cause you to not love your dog anymore?
I think at this point, I don't think so. I think at this point, we've just developed such a deep bond and a connection between the two of us, and more so understanding. And I think part of that probably goes back on my understanding that I don't even think there's anything. Well, let me rephrase that. If he were to kill someone, would it possibly make me have a different connection with him? Probably. But would it inspire action for me to kill him? I don't know. I don't think so.
Well, there was that story. Now, I understand this is a different species of animal. And again, I'm going to predicate this next story on the idea that for the purposes of this conversation, we're not judging the actions of the individual in choosing to have this particular pet.
Yeah.
Although I'm sure we could, off the record, but we won't judge this person. So I believe it was in Connecticut but I could be wrong, where there was a woman that had a pet chimp that was loving and that she had for many years, and that it knew her neighbors and the neighbors had a good relationship with it. And I believe the story was that one of her neighbors got a new haircut or dyed her hair or was wearing a wig or somehow had made a change in her appearance such that apparently the chimp did not recognize her when she came to visit, and the chimp literally attacked this woman's face and basically ripped her face to shreds. I mean, she's had a zillion operations and she still barely looks recognizably human in the face. It's sad to say. And what the photos I've seen of her immediately after the attack were so horrifying. You can't unsee them. You just can't. And I honestly wish I had never seen them. That is the reality that a friend of this woman who had this pet chimp will have to live with for the rest of her life. If that were your pet and that sort of thing had happened, would you still love the pet?
That's a really good question, because it also makes me think of a story or another set of circumstances where my friend, he has 2 dogs, and I remember he was sharing this story with us where one of the dogs ended up attacking the other one, and he actually had to put that dog down.
Which dog?
The dog that attacked the other dog. He said he had to put the dog down, and he said it was one of the most challenging experiences as a human that he ever went through. Not only taking another living being's life, but taking the life of a dog that he had such a strong connection with. Now, that particular story that you just shared, it sounds like very similar to that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to what degree can you actually love another being where they're not necessarily loving you back, but they're actually causing harm, physical harm that can then turn into mental harm and all these other things outside of that? Because then you're also having to live with the memory of it happening. It's not necessarily the physical harm there, you know, not anymore, but more so it's the memory that you have in the back of your mind for however long of the animal doing it to you. So I don't know. That's a very interesting question to ponder, and I'll be curious to hear your perspective on that as far as what is the line that you would choose to draw. And then at what point do you draw the line between, and this is the story similar to my friend that went through, at what point, or would you ever draw the line between life or death as far as putting the pet down because he or she had caused so much damage to someone else, such as in my friend's case, I mean, literally physically attacking the other dog, and had he not separated the two, he said that the other dog might have been dead.
Well, one day my husband was walking down the street in our neighborhood, and on a corner, two dogs were in a vicious fight. They were just random dogs, apparently, that were being walked by their humans, and they didn't like each other, as dogs are sometimes inclined to do. And they got into a very vicious fight, and people were screaming. And at one point, my husband said, someone said, "I'm pulling out a gun." And the implication of that was that someone was carrying a gun and was going to shoot one of those dogs. And that dog's life would have been over on the spot. And a decision, I don't know what happened with that. And I know for a fact that my husband didn't stick around to see what was happening. And I probably would have found a way to leave that situation too. That to me was a very smart decision. If I were there, you know, it's a similar sort of thing I feel as when there are humans attacking each other. To what extent do we intervene or not? There have been times when I have seen on the street a male threatening. It sometimes looks like it's a man who knows a woman, but sometimes it's been a situation where a woman, usually I've never seen this happen to a man, although it might, where a woman is being yelled at or leered at inappropriately or something, usually by a male who is homeless or appears to have a mental problem or is threatening in one way or another. I will usually stand there and stare at the man. And a lot of that is to use my own height, physical size, healthiness, all of those sort of masculine attributes to intimidate the other male, and make sure that that woman feels safe. Would I actually intervene and ward off the attack if it were to that? Part of why I do that is because I'm trying to avoid that happening. My gut says that yes, I probably would intervene. Is that a smart decision on my part? My gut also says that it's probably not. May well make it worse. I may well end up injured, or any sort of horrible outcomes can happen. And the same thing goes with animals. The only thing is, as much as we say we love animals, they are part of our families, we would, as you mentioned last week, you would defend Caleb should some person attack him. The story about your friend and the dog fight that his dog was in and how he ended up responding to it goes as to a critical difference between animals and who are parts of our family and humans who are parts of our family, which is that we will sanction less allow for humans to kill animals at our will. And there's no crime. There's crime in animal cruelty, and there's crime for randomly just killing someone else's dog or something like that. But generally, if we take a dog to the vet and that vet puts it down, or if we abandon the dog to a shelter that we know will ultimately kill it, it's essentially giving that dog or cat a death sentence. We don't judge the human being for taking that. We may judge the person who abandons the dog at the shelter, but we don't necessarily judge the shelter staff who's responsible for putting the dog down. We certainly don't judge the vet or the human being that would take the dog in who's sick or otherwise, in this case, has an intractable behavior problem and put it down. We don't judge. Whereas a human being, it's a different matter. Melody, I want to say it is always so good to see you. Thank you for joining us and saying hi.
Well, question for you then, because you're definitely spot on when it comes to this whole perception of life and how one is viewed compared to one form and then compared to the other. How do you believe many of us even view the life of any other species other than ourselves? Like, do we even recognize that as a form of life? Because if we do, how is it that an action of taking it to the vet or putting it down ourselves is something that's not being held with the same exact consequences as taking out another human being?
I feel like there are degrees. So one thing that happened when I was younger, and this is not uncommon in the area of the country that I grew up in, was that there was a neighbor who had a dog, and that dog was old and sick. And so the father of the neighbor took his son out and gave his son the family gun and told the son to shoot the dog and end its life. And that was according to the father, a manhood ritual to help make the son into a man.
Right.
A part of me understands that, and there's definitely plenty of historical precedent for that sort of thing. Now, the New Yorker in me, you don't hear those sorts of things. That would, if I were to hear a New Yorker saying the exact same thing, I would think that was exceedingly bizarre. But where I grew up, that was not seen as particularly bizarre, although not everyone would have done it. There were, again, no threats of legal recrimination, or no one accused the father or the son of murder. There was nothing like that. But the father, in taking his son out there, clearly recognized that there was some sort of trauma that would be associated with the death of that pet when the son killed it, because he described it as a manhood ritual. A manhood ritual is usually associated with a male child enduring some sort of trial that he overcomes a stronger and more mature human being, better prepared to take on whatever male roles are in that society. Now, I'm not making a judgment. I want to make this clear as to whether that sort of ritual is something that's constructive in society or not. I am not making a statement one way or the other about patriarchy or larger gender roles. I'm just talking about the meaning of that within a particular subculture. At the same time, the other night, I woke up, I went to the kitchen. I live in New York City, for those of you that are not from New York, so this is much, much more common here than in other parts of the country. I live in a very, very old apartment building. It is probably 130 to 150 years old. And it's crowded, and it's an attached apartment building. Literally on the street, there's an entire block of these attached buildings like the one I live in. And so what I'm about to describe did not necessarily, in fact, I'm pretty sure it did not originate in our apartment. It comes in. These sorts of things happen in a crowded city like New York. I woke up, went into another room one night and saw a water bug, which is basically like a large roach walking around. Yeah. And without hesitation, I grabbed a paper towel and I killed it. It's an animal. It's a living being. And like a dog, it is one that is associated with humans. They say that if humans were to go off the face of the earth, roaches, water bugs, and other insect species that are reliant on us would be extinct very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And yet there was no consequences. I'm saying this without any fear whatsoever of criminal prosecution or being accused of animal abuse. And anyone that would accuse me of saying that, or of being that sort of person who would point their finger at me and say, you are a horrible human being, you killed a water bug, I would wager the overwhelming majority of people hearing such an accusation would not take that person making the accusation seriously.
Well, two things. First is I'm actually writing up a report here, and I will be serving you
with papers,
with some papers at the end of this show. But the second thing is, I think you bring up an interesting point, because I experience a similar thing, especially when it comes to spiders. I don't know where it comes from. I don't know how this fear of spiders has been instilled within me. But I will tell you this, that no matter what the size of a spider and what the texture of the spider may be, there is just fear. If I were to describe it from 0 to 10, it is 15 and above. And I'm talking like even the smallest spiders. And for me, the first instinct is to do it exactly as you described, to kill. But then the question of that I face afterwards is like, what was that action and why did I choose to do it? I remember, in fact, I'll never forget this story. It was in my most recent relationship I was in, and we had a spider in the room. And because of my relationship with spiders, which sounds like a very similar relationship to the relationship that you have with that dog that's always barking at you. It is that the status of it is complicated. And so there was a spider in the room, and it was crawling on the wall. And I remember I was sitting on top of the bed, and I just noticed a spider crawling beside me. And I completely lost it. I jumped off the bed, and I was about to run out of the room. And yet internally I knew that probably that spider was in no position to harm me in a way that would put me in the situation where it's life or death. Mm-hmm. So I had told my partner if she could kill the spider. Now she looked at me through the lens of like, seriously, you can't take care of a spider that is literally the size of a breadcrumb? And so I interrupted her workday to take out the spider. Now, there was not only the sequence. You, man. There was not only the sequence of her taking out the spider, but then afterwards, it was the frustration that she had to deal with in disrupting her own workday to literally get up and kill a spider. And that was, for me, that was a moment where I just, and this has happened multiple times, trust me. And in fact, the larger the spiders get, like the more that thing will set in. And I kid you not, there have been times, this especially happened, I remember this happened once or twice at my parents' house, where I was aware of a spider living in the room, and I actually did not sleep in the room. I kid you not. I slept in the family room because I was that terrified of the unknown.
Well, let's take it up a notch. One might say
as if that's not already the ceiling.
Yeah, I know. I mean, let's water bugs and spiders are invertebrates. They have very, very limited nervous systems. They are very, very limited in their intellectual capacity, and they are quote unquote lower forms of life, and they are infinitely more numerous, and they actually, in both cases, could at least theoretically pose risks. I mean, I personally know someone that ended up in the hospital, right? She got bit by a brown recluse and she almost died. And of course, diseases spread by things like roaches and water bugs and things like that have caused so many deaths. But let's just talk about an animal that is significant higher in terms of its complexity and close to humans, but that you likely would view a threat as a
Yeah.
threat. Rats. What if it were a rat that you saw in your house? Would you
Oh,
kill it?
instinct would be the same. Yeah, kill it. And I think, and the more that I think about it, I think
Yeah, rats are sometimes pets too, interestingly enough.
the desire to kill or to get rid of it in some particular way, and it's actually so funny that we're even talking about this. Remember the book that you sent me?
Yes. The
Yeah,
Lucifer principle.
yeah.
Yes.
Well, the image right here.
Yeah.
So what the reason why I think personally I experienced this, and I'd be curious to hear why you experience such desire to kill or get rid of, is because A, due to its difference, there's not enough of a familiarity for me around that particular instinct or animal for me to develop enough of a relationship with them where I understand that, okay, they're not here to harm me. For example, like the reason why I don't wake up in the mornings and wanted to kill Caleb is because I have developed trust with him. I've developed enough of a bond where I'm able to understand the fact that his presence is not there to harm my presence or my being. With rats and spiders, because of the fact that I don't see them on a frequent enough basis, and oftentimes they appear suddenly with no preparation, it sets off alarms within
Yeah.
me. My body goes from a complete sense of comfort to all of a sudden my safety could be at risk because I don't know. There's so many things about their
Yeah.
existence I don't know. One of them is being movement,
Yeah.
and depending on how fast they move, I think my instinct are telling me that, okay, if they're moving really fast, therefore they're probably on an attack. So the body is constantly saying defend, 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 and the way to defend it is to establish that form of dominance.
Well, and then there's also the thought processes. We understand generally, although not specifically, we can predict the thought processes of a dog, a
Exactly.
cat, a
Exactly.
horse, a cow, things like that. Whereas a rat,
Yeah.
I don't know what's going through its head except that it can bite sometimes and
Yeah.
carry plague.
Yeah.
And
And unless you're around it enough, it becomes even harder to
yeah,
predict that thought process.
yeah.
And spiders is the same exact way. I've never had a pet spider, nor do I have the desire to have a pet spider. In fact, one of the things, it's funny to even have this conversation right now. So 4 years ago, when I was embarking on this journey of wanting to dig deeper within my own experience and reframe certain things within my life as far as the adversities go, I remember I went to an event where we were able to look at different organites or crystals.
Mm.
And they supposedly, the at least my interpretation of it is that through an organite or a crystal, doing forms of like meditation or mindfulness, I'm able to tap into higher realms, higher forms of consciousness, whichever way you want to look at it. So I chose to buy an organite that had a spider within it, not a live spider, but a metal spider that the person had crafted. And the reason why I chose to do that was because I thought that if I was able to be close to the spider and that I was wearing it every single day, then I might be able to develop a sense of trust and overcome that sense of fear. Well, 4 years later or 5 years later, that's still not a thing. So I'm wondering, to what degree does the being has to be physically alive for me to understand its movement, for me to understand its thought pattern, and for me to understand to what degree does its existence play a role within mine?
If you saw a dead rat on the street, would you feel bad? If you saw a dead dog on the street, would you feel bad?
Absolutely.
Both?
Yes to both. And from personal experience, I've seen both in that state and I felt bad. I think the difference there is that in that state, I think I am able to predict the thought process and that is there is none.
Mm,
And I am able to predict the
wow.
movement, which is none.
Yeah.
But when they're living, it's harder for me to conceptualize, like, what direction is it going to go? Is it going to go towards me? What is its intention when it's coming towards me? Is it equally as afraid as I am? Therefore, it is willing to defend itself as I am willing to. So there's just all these different thoughts that go through my mind as I think about it. But yeah, it's a complicated topic, but it's also a fascinating one, because why do we behave the way that we do and act the way that we do, while also understanding that if the core question is, a form of dominance, let's say, well, clearly the bigger one, and especially one that has access to whatever resource, should not be afraid, but yet many of us are.
I knew a woman once that loved to put cute little clothes on her little toy dog and put it in a baby carriage or a stroller and roll it around the parks of New York City.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that was weird?
I would say it was strange. I would
Why?
say because it's not normal and it's not what's expected. I think
Why is it not normal?
Well, I think for me there is underlying expectation that comes with being that comes with having an animal, a dog or a cat. And I think because I'm not able to communicate with the animal where I'm able to get their consent of whether or not that is clothing that they approve of, I find it strange for me.
That's true.
I
That's
find it
very
strange.
true.
I find it. That's why I find it strange for me to dress up a dog, when the reality of the matter is they may want to walk around the way that they do. It's like the same exact reason why sometimes I've done this once, and I mean it lasted, I don't know, 5 seconds. It was extremely cold outside, and a friend of mine sent me these, I guess you could say, like, boots for
Yes.
Caleb. And so I put it on one of his paws, and he immediately took it off. And he was not, and that's where I realized it's like, okay, you're a dog, you're its own being. Because I'm also, and here's another reason why I personally think it's strange. Now, if anyone else thinks it's normal, it's perfectly fine. I'm looking at it through my lens. I'm trying to put myself in his shoes. Like, if I were to come to you and start putting random shit on you, like boots on your feet, boots on your arms, and dress you up in, I don't know, Halloween costume in the middle of February, how would you feel?
Well, I'll tell you how I feel. It's funny because when I was in high school, my parents one time said, "Oh, Scott, we're going to go shopping in Kansas City," which was the big city a few hours from my house, "and you're going to get new clothes." So I was so excited. And we went through some stores, and they didn't like anything that I liked. So nothing was going to get purchased. But then we went to a certain store, and they were like, "Why don't you try on a safari outfit?" And so I did. And they're like, "Oh, you look perfect in that." And then as the conversation went on, I think the whole thing that I realized was that they had decided that I should have a safari outfit, and I should wear that to school or wherever. And they thought that I would look cute in a safari outfit. And they were therefore going to get me one. And I was furious. I thought that a high school boy of my age wearing a safari outfit would be ridiculed. I would have been. I thought it was ridiculous.
Yeah.
To be wearing a safari outfit in the middle of Kansas, doing nothing, having anything to do with a safari. And I said, I don't want to wear it. I don't want you to buy it. I don't want. And then they became very angry with me. We went home, and actually they never bought me clothes again.
Yeah.
And in fact, so later, shortly after that, I was not allowed to wear any. They're like, "Okay, we're not buying you clothes if you don't want this." And so I did not get any new clothes at all until I got a job at the local department store and just started buying them for myself. And so I know exactly how that feels. I was furious. And so I can imagine, who knows whether the dog likes it or not, but the dog presumably didn't have any fashion sense, although maybe it did. But it certainly didn't like something that was foreign and
sense
to
of
its
discomfort.
experience uncomfortable or unnatural on it. Although leashes are a different story. But dogs, once they have leashes on them, a lot of them seem to look forward to having them put back on.
Yeah. I'll also add on to what you just said. I think there's an important lesson. So I'll speak for myself. There's an important lesson for me to take away from the story that you just shared. And that is choosing to go into events with a set agenda.
Yes.
Because when I was younger, I've experienced the same exact thing. And I won't name the people on this show, but there were certain people I would go shopping with, and I would go to like a specific store which had a specific sense to it, like thrift shops, for example, right?
Yeah.
When I was younger, I truly did not like going to thrift shops because I didn't understand the concept of thrift shops.
Yeah.
I thought the concept of a thrift shop was, okay, worn down clothing, no main brands, no items that would be relevant to what anyone else is wearing. So talk about wearing something that's making you look like an outsider. It was probably wearing things from a thrift shop.
Yeah.
Now, it was in that moment I realized that sometimes, and this goes outside of shopping, this goes, in my experience, it's been with many other areas of life. Sometimes when I'm asked to do something such as go shopping or go have food with someone, there is a specific agenda that carries with that individual, to a point where I even question sometimes throughout the experience of like, why am I even here?
Yeah.
Why am I even here? Because the person has already a fixed mindset around it. So if I'm telling you, Scott, would you like to go get some food? And it doesn't even matter what you pick because I'm going to go get that pizza.
Yeah.
It's just that I'm choosing to go there because I don't want to go there alone.
Yeah.
And that's where I think there's that, for me, it's an important lesson and a reminder from what you shared. And that's choosing to challenge my own assumptions, my own expectations, and my own sense of agenda.
Yeah.
And that sense of agenda, it carries into everything. Phone calls that we choose to have, conversations that we choose to have with people, experiences that we go through. And I think the same thing applies to pets. You know, it's like, I'm going to take him for a walk, but what is my agenda for that? Am I taking the dog for a walk, or am I taking the dog with me, or am I dressing the dog because I want to feel a certain way? You know, does having a dog wear a costume, does that somehow elevate my status as an owner? Does it make me feel better compared to others?
Or to the dog.
Or to the dog? Does it somehow enhance my status when it comes to my wealth that someone else is not able to afford? So I think there's just so many things within that I just found really fascinating within what you just described.
Do you think that one day pets will be the only animals left on this planet? Or at least the only animals maybe outside of birds and insects?
I think it's possible. I think if anything that I have learned to this point is that, in my opinion, it's all life is a cycle. So I think to a degree, if, let's say, I mean, we're assuming that we are humans, the last component of that cycle. And so at some point, that cycle has to restart or evolve into something else. And I think with every form of evolution, there is a beginning. Supposedly, there's a middle and an end. And maybe the dogs and the cats and some of the other animals, maybe they're the beginning. I mean, they were the beginning. They were there before us. Maybe not the dogs, but definitely other forms of animals were there before the humans, the human beings. So that's an interesting question. And if so, what would the planet look like? You know, would the planet be able to sustain if it was only animals? And to what degree? And to what degree have we as humans made the possibility for the planet to sustain due to our existence?
If you could be a dog, would you?
Probably. I would love to be a dog. I think I'm a part squirrel, so I think I experience some aspect of being an animal. But I think being a dog would be interesting. I think much of it would depend on who I'm able to share my life with.
Yeah.
Because there are some dogs that don't have as fortunate of a lifestyle,
Yes.
and just true of other animals. So I think if I could be Caleb and being able to share life with someone like myself, like absolutely. Not even a question. Would you?
Yeah. If it were a dog like Caleb, absolutely. To not have the stress. Sometimes part of the human experience is suffering those things.
Yeah.
Anxiety, failure, hurt, disappointment, disagreements with my parents about what clothes I should wear.
Or like where to go to the bathroom.
Yeah, where to go to the bathroom.
Just go anywhere you
Friendships
want.
ending and new ones being born. All of
Do you
those.
think they experience loss like we do?
I'm 100% sure they do. But I also suspect that they don't intellectualize it the same way we do too. And as much as I love the wondrous things about being human, if I never could imagine what those wondrous things were, but didn't have to experience a lot of the negatives, maybe it would be better to be a dog.
Why do you think being an intellectual, or do you think being an intellectual complicates life in areas where complication is unnecessary?
I'm going to let you answer that because I seriously don't consider myself an intellectual. I truly don't. I just don't. I'm someone who likes to talk.
Having the capacity to be an intellectual.
I think that having curiosity, I believe that loving to think, and I believe that being like a squirrel, digging beneath the surface, or being like a dog, digging that hole in the ground underneath that
surface,
that surface, underneath that bone, so or digging that hole so you can bury that bone, or find that bone once you've buried it, is a curse sometimes.
Yeah.
I think it has the potential to make one great, but I think it also has the potential to cause suffering. For my podcast, and maybe we'll use this as a way to move towards our usual closing, for my podcast, Scott Mason's Purpose Highway, which you can find at purposehighway.com, I recently interviewed a comedian named Frank King that is also a suicide awareness activist. And he's done a lot of research on this topic, as well as on depression. One of the things he points out, as someone who is very, very, very intelligent, there is a documented link between high IQ as well as high levels of creativity and mental illness, including depression and suicidal ideation.
Yeah.
And I, to date, now this may have happened, so I don't want to say it in a sweeping fashion, have not heard of dogs or cats attempting suicide.
Yeah.
And perhaps that is because they are not, quote unquote, gifted with the intellectual capacity that we have, and therefore don't carry its burdens. Oleg, do you have anything you want to say? And then maybe you could tell us a little bit about your own shows.
I do. So I've actually experienced a form of my own transformation, I guess, when it comes to this whole concept of intelligence. And I started to realize that I'm in a position right now where I think I'm seeking new experiences. And what I mean by that is having conversations with people of all types of experiences. So whether it's one that may not have the same abilities when it comes to hearing or speaking or whatever it may be, because I'm realizing that there's so much more to the journey, but at the same time, it's what is exactly as you just described. It's a blessing and a curse. It's a double-edged sword in the same exact instant, because then, yes, there's that constant curiosity of wanting to learn more about how do people overcome certain adversities? How do people find meaning within certain hardships? How do people interpret suffering? How do people interpret pain? Are there any aspects of suffering or pain that are absolutely necessary to one's form of survival and existence in this world? And are there aspects that are not? For example, searching for purpose. If theoretically all of us or many of us have the ability to think a conscious thought, why is a sense of purpose something that is so difficult to find? And that's where I think it is, I can relate to what you just described. Components of anxiety, depression, and stress are just so evident because there are some questions that truly don't have an answer.
Yeah.
And that's for me one of them. It's like if everyone has the capacity due to consciousness, which is available to us and it's not available to, let's say, theoretically many of the animals, why are some of these questions such, why do they become such great magnitude that many of us literally searched a whole life finding and never do?
Oleg, tell us out loud the name of your two shows, and then let's close out.
One is called Overcoming Odds, and then the other one is called The Power of Your Story. Both focus on similar elements as we just described: tapping into one's story, sharing it, learning from it, ultimately empowering others through their story and helping them see that there is a quote-unquote light at the end of the tunnel. But one other thing I'll mention before we close out is actually for anyone that's listening, anyone that's enjoyed, if you would consider leaving us your feedback, your thoughts through our Facebook or LinkedIn pages. I think both Scott and I would greatly appreciate that, because if anything, and I'll speak for myself, and Scott, feel free to chime in, but this sense of community that we are developing and we've developed through this particular platform has been unbelievable.
Yes.
And so I think having the space to share the things that we know or sometimes don't know, but are just curious to explore, it's fascinating. And if anything, I wish more of spaces like this in the world.
Yeah. And we thank every single person who bothers to join us here today. Thank you all so much. We will see you next week.
Next Thursday. Bye-bye.